one thing that many of us were frustrated about was the lack of a sort of bigger vision in the budget. It was all about the bean counting of tax increases and spending cuts, and not thinking about a broader agenda for growth, particularly an agenda driven by, well-targeted tax cuts, but also supply-side reforms.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh, and I'm the Head of Public Policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question to a top political and economic thinker. Today's question, is the Autumn Statement fair? I'm excited to be joined by Julian and Jessop, who is the Economics Fellow at the IEA, as well as an independent economist with 35 years of experience across government and business. Now, Julian, before we get on to some of the discussion about the measures and the setting of the statement, I think the most striking announcement were some of the forecasts from the OBR yesterday. We saw some quite depressing figures about a long-running recession, about real incomes being below pre-COVID levels for the next 5 years. What kind of trust should we put in these figures, and what is the state of the British economy?
Well, first of all, I don't think we should put too much faith in the specific numbers. I mean, people get really obsessed by what, in the bigger scheme of things, are relatively small changes in measured output in the economy. But I think there's no doubt at all that we are heading into some form of recession, however you choose to define that. And it's not just the OBR that's been saying that. I think almost any private sector forecast would say that we're inevitably heading into recession. And if you look at business and consumer surveys, it's pretty clear that the economy is heading for a downturn. Even if the official numbers aren't telling you that we're in recession, of course, it will still feel like a recession to many people who are struggling with the cost of living crisis, and in particular to pay essential bills for food and energy. So we're definitely heading into a pretty dark period. To be a bit less negative, though, I think that this recession is probably going to be a bit shorter and maybe shallower than the norm. That's partly because a lot of it is driven by very high inflation, and there are good reasons to think that inflation is going to drop off pretty sharply. It's also an unusual recession because unemployment is very low and likely to remain relatively low. So that's the difference from the stagflation of the 1970s. And interestingly, and finally, the OBR's numbers that were published alongside the budget were actually a bit less pessimistic than those that have come out only a few weeks before from the Bank of England. And actually, the autumn statement itself was partly responsible for that, because it did provide a bit of a fiscal boost to the economy this year and next.
Yeah, I'm interested in the divergence between those two different estimates, which I suppose kind of tells you on the length of this recession, which we seem to think we're in. You're more or less making it up. You're not exactly making it up, but you're more or less making it up, or it's very dependent on the assumptions going forward. I think there's an interesting question here, though, as well, about what has driven us into this recession. So I think that the number one factor seems to be the war with Ukraine, the terms of trade shock. We then also have a hangover from COVID and perhaps supply chain issues. We have a lot of people who've left the workforce in the UK due to long-term sickness or retirement. And on top of that, we have this inflation issue, which the Bank of England, we think, fueled through very loose monetary policy. Now they're having, because they didn't put up interest rates soon enough, you could argue. What's to blame? Which one of those three factors do you think is most important? Is it a mixture of all three, or is there something I'm missing?
Yeah, well, it's worth stressing that this is very much a global downturn being driven by pretty similar factors from country to country. So I think we need to look for a global explanation, and the obvious one, as you say, is indeed inflation. Inflation is high and rising almost everywhere, at least in the Western world. The story is a bit different in China and Japan, but there are separate issues there. The reason why inflation has taken off, I think, is a mix of factors. I mean, partly it's a good news story that the world economy rebounded more quickly than expected from the COVID recession, partly due to the success of the vaccine rollout. So there was an element of demand pull inflation in there. The second thing, though, was the cost push inflation, particularly the rise in energy prices, but also the fact that supply was still being constrained by lingering problems to do with COVID, including the increase in the number of long-term sick people in the UK, but disruption to supply chains from China itself still being in lockdown. And then the third factor, the one I think we don't pay enough attention to, is the role of central banks, not just keeping interest rates very low, but also printing enormous amounts of money. And I think if it hadn't been for all that money printing, then increases in inflation in some areas, food and energy prices, would have been offset by much lower prices elsewhere. So central banks basically provided the monetary conditions that allowed inflation to take off because of those supply and demand pressures. The good news, though, is that all of those factors are starting to reverse. So the global economy is slowing. That's not a good thing for other reasons, but it's going to reduce the demand pressures on inflation. The supply pressures are starting to ease. So if we look at commodity prices in particular, including natural gas, those prices have fallen pretty sharply. So have wholesale prices of food and global markets. And finally, the central banks are starting to wake up. So we are starting to see interest rates return to more normal levels, and banks start to scale back the quantitative easing, in some cases going the opposite way, quantitative tightening. So, selling back the bonds that they had bought previously. So I think there are good reasons to expect inflation to drop sharply next year as those factors kick in. But in the short term, we're seeing a position where, central banks are tightening monetary policy, inflation is very high, and a tiny minority of countries, I think pretty much one, namely the UK, is planning to tighten fiscal policy as well. So it's understandable why the economic outlook over the next year or so is still pretty gloomy.
Yeah, let's get onto that. So the very much the context of this autumn statement was there's a very tough decisions to be made. There's a 55 billion pound black hole, as it was said. I think it's worth unpacking what they mean by a black hole. There needs to be some fiscal responsibility to, some have argued, and Labour Party is still arguing, clean up the mess caused by the mini budget in September. What is the truth in terms of what Jeremy Hunt was looking at when he came to power, when he was working out the statement? Is it about those global economic factors, or is it about the mini budget? And then have they kind of made the right response to what that kind of fiscal situation is about?
Well, let's start with quite a long list of ifs here. I mean, if you believe that there is a 55 billion hole in the public finances, and if you believe it's necessary to close that in order to restore market confidence, and if you believe that's best done through some mixed package of tax and tax increases and spending cuts, then I think the autumn statement actually probably made the best of a bad job. I mean, there were a few positives in it, or at least things that might otherwise have been a lot worse. So most of the tax increases and spending cuts are backloaded into towards the end of the 5-year forecast horizon. So they're not going to immediately hit growth now. There's actually a bit of spending increase in the short term, mainly to do with cost of living support and helping people with their energy bills. So it might mean that the hit to the economy is a bit less in the short term than it would otherwise have been. But if I go back to those ifs, there are question marks over all of them. I mean, the so-called 55 billion black hole, I mean, that's just a number. I mean, it's dependent on all sorts of assumptions, including 5-year forecasts for growth and inflation, which we know will almost certainly be wrong, and assumptions about interest rates and about commodity prices. Indeed, since that forecast was made, interest rates have actually fallen. That's the interest rates that matter on long-term government debt in particular. And that's probably reduced the size of the fiscal hole by about 10 billion, just because of a short-term move in the market. It's also worth stressing that there's more than one way to fill a fiscal hole. And I think one thing that many of us were frustrated about was the lack of a sort of bigger vision in the budget. It was all about the bean counting of tax increases and spending cuts, and not thinking about a broader agenda for growth, particularly an agenda driven by well-targeted tax cuts, but also supply side reforms, whether that's housing market or childcare or anything else you might care to think of. It was all very much about balancing the books in a very sort of abacus economic sense.
Yeah.
And if it sounds like I'm echoing some of the language of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, that's deliberate. I think the pendulum has swung too far from a pro-growth strategy that was well-meaning and I think fundamentally sound, but badly done, back towards the old orthodoxy of balancing the books through austerity that may well prove to be counterproductive.
Yeah, well, I think we're in this intriguing situation where there is a bit of a disconnect between what the government's doing and what they're saying. So certainly taxes are on their way to a 70-year high, but at least in the next 3 years, we're actually seeing some quite substantial spending increases, as you've said, on the energy package and other support measures, as well as putting up funding to the NHS and education. So at the same time as putting up taxes, it feels more like, at least in that 3-year period, it's a very redistributive budget. It's a very kind of, I could see the Labour Party getting up and putting this kind of budget, and the Conservatives saying it's too big government, it doesn't encourage entrepreneurship and economic growth. It's attacking the wealth creators with all sorts of tax increases, like freezing the thresholds, like reducing the 45p additional rate, by changing around some of the measures in terms of dividend allowances and whatnot. So that's next 3 years. Then there's this kind of at the 4 and 5 year mark, we're suddenly going to see the government taking all this fiscal responsibility, as you've said, very much dependent on the idea of ticking the fiscal box hole to say that we're going to have debt falling as a percentage of GDP in 5 years' time by 0.3%, as if anyone believes that such small specific numbers that far in advance or in any meaningful sense. So what the government, I think, has actually done in the short run is a very big state budget to tick off a lot of boxes. You know, we've got this rhetoric around, well, what we need here is a responsible budget. You know, we're going to make tough decisions, but it doesn't really feel like they've made any tough decisions. They've pushed tough decisions out long into the future, whilst in the short run, trying to keep everyone happy, except for the people who actually pay taxes, who are going to have to pay a bit more.
Well, some very good points in there. Reading some of the commentary over the last 24 hours or so, lots of people are actually quite confused what to make of this budget, including sort of many people on the left. You know, do they approve of this budget, or
is this an evil austerity budget, or is this a high tax budget? They can't quite work it out. Yeah,
exactly. If you're just presented with the bare facts, then it's hard to guess, you know, what political party the Chancellor just presented this package is actually from. I mean, certainly big chunks of it that are very much the sort of thing that Labour would have done. So, you know, extending the windfall tax all the way out to 2028, which is getting a bit silly. I mean, even if you believe there was a windfall that needs to be taxed, do you really think that windfall is still in place many years in the future when the energy crisis will have passed? Lowering the threshold at which people start paying the 45p upper rate of income tax, I think is almost just symbolic. I mean, it's only going to raise a small amount of money, if any. And it maybe does send a signal that, you know, those on higher incomes will be paying a bigger share taking a bigger share of the burden. But it also, you know, adds this sort of negative signal that you're sending to people on higher earnings who often have more flexibility about their choices about whether to work or retire or set up new businesses or indeed whether to work in the UK at all. So it's a negative measure as far as the supply side of the economy is concerned, for potentially only a very small gain in revenue, if any at all. So there are lots of aspects of the autumn statement. They're very much sort of, you know, Labour, you know, bash the rich rather than I think really thought through. On the fiscal rules, I think actually, to be fair to Jeremy Hunt, he has followed what Kwasi Kwarteng was promising to do, which is to extend the period over which we assess the path for debt and borrowing. So instead of worrying about getting debt falling over 3 years, now it's over 5 years, which I think is more sensible. There's no particular magic level for debt, and I don't think we're really near a danger level. But most economists would agree the important thing is to prevent debt from rising a lot further, and ideally having it falling, which is what this package on paper does. But it still leaves lots of oddities, as you say. The main impact of the tax increases and spending cuts will come after the next general election. So it's not certain that they're even going to happen. It could be suggested he's just leaving a trap for the next government, which may well be a Labour one. There are suggestions that this is all about restoring credibility in the markets, but frankly, markets were already pretty stable before the autumn statement. To the extent there was a premium in there in bond yields in particular for the Kwasi Kwarteng mini budget, that had already gone. Nobody in the markets, nobody in the city was screaming for big tax increases or spending cuts. So if this was a statement to or for the markets, then I don't think the markets really cared. Politically, it's clearly not done well. I think the only newspaper that's had a positive headline today was the Daily Express, which was pleased about the indexation of the state pension to inflation. But every other newspaper, whatever their political perspective, was focusing on the tax pain. So even if those tax increases are not coming straight away, I still think they're going to weigh on consumer confidence. And then businesses, although there weren't any massive changes in business tax in this statement, remember they are facing the increase in corporation tax in April, which is just daft. I mean, that is definitely damaging to business confidence, to investment in the UK, to our global standing at other time when other countries, even the likes of France, are looking to lower the burden of corporation tax. So it's a strange statement. Some good bits, some bad bits, but overall, I think it's left a lot of people thinking, "Oh, I don't feel any happier after this than I was a few days ago."
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in unpacking a little bit the kind of redistributive elements of this and what this effectively says about the social contract. I think there's a lot of sense from younger people, particularly younger, ambitious, entrepreneurial people who work hard. They go to university, they end up getting a kind of decent job in a city in the UK. But what they're going to find from this budget is probably somewhere approaching a 50% marginal tax rate, particularly once they include their university fees in the mix. They're not going to be in any position to lay down roots and buy a home, because, as you've said, there's not really much in here when it comes to planning reform. Instead, the government's choosing to, as you've said, put up pensions quite substantially by 10% along with inflation. On top of that, they're giving out, was it 150 quid pensioner payment for no other reason than it seems to be to tick a box. But of course, we know 1/3 of pensioners are millionaires. So they're literally giving money to millionaires just because they happen to be over a certain age. And at the same time, we're putting money into the NHS. That's generally beneficial to older people. We're not reforming the NHS or improving the service or improving the efficiency. It seems like the whole kind of package here is very much tagged towards again a redistribution between generations as much as it is between the workers and people who don't work. It seems like almost a fundamental unfairness in this budget, in the way that who they've chosen to help, because that's again, it's a path of least resistance, but it doesn't necessarily feel like the right path, at least in my mind.
Yeah, well, you're right. There's a lot of nonsense spoken about inequality in the UK. If you look at the actual numbers, income inequality has barely changed over the last decade or two. However, wealth inequality has increased. And there are a number of drivers for that. Actually, probably the most important, as in so many cases, is what's happening to the housing market. So the fact that house prices have risen a lot, obviously that helps people who own houses, and they tend to be wealthier people. So that's a big factor. And you could do an awful lot there by getting house prices down by building more. So again, that's an example of how a structural reform, in this case to the planning laws, could help tackle inequality there. Another factor, though, has been the triple lock on the state pension. So this is the idea that the state pension always rises by a minimum of 2.5%, or the increase in inflation, or the increase in average earnings. And over time, what that has is sort of a ratchet effect that basically pensioners are protected on the downside. They always get a minimum of 2.5%, but they always gain on the upside, because they always do well if average earnings are higher, if inflation is high. So at some point, the pensions triple lock has to go. Otherwise, we'll be spending almost all of our national income on paying state pensions, including, as you say, in many cases to people who don't really need it. So at some point, the triple lock on the state pension has to go. My preference would be simply to replace it with a double lock of maybe 2.5% and inflation, dropping the earnings link. And also to put a bit more effort into means testing pensioner benefits. I wouldn't necessarily means test the pension itself, but I would certainly put more effort into making improving the means tested pension credit, which is a top up to state pension. I think we should put more effort into that as a way of getting money to people who really need it. But there are a whole host of things that need tackling that are very difficult to do because, as we know, older people tend to be more active politically, more likely to vote, and in particular more likely to vote for the Conservative Party. So that's undoubtedly a constraint that a Conservative Chancellor in particular is going to be facing.
So I misspoke. It's actually a £300 payment, not a £150 payment. But I'm kind of interested in the reason why I think we can end up in a lot of these conflicts is because we've got such a low growth economy. The fact is the economy is growth has been anemic for the last decade. We're looking at another real terms fall in income over the next period. It's kind of like quite a depressing picture in that sense. Now, this was the kind of the final part of the budget, which was meant to be this kind of answer to the growth question. I was wondering what you made of that section. I think there was a lot of focus on boosting skills, on HS2 and other infrastructure, on public R&D funding. The government's continuing with levelling up. That's the kind of Whitehall choosing to hand out money to certain favoured projects in parts of the country. A bit of talk about subsidising innovation, the DMU. What do you make of the kind of a growth approach of Hunt and Rishi, particularly, I suppose, versus Kwasi and Liz?
Well, I mean, currently there is quite a bit of overlap. I mean, large parts of the growth plan, as it was from Truss and Kwarteng, does seem to have survived in some form. And if I'm being optimistic here, to use sort of simple analogy, the tortoise and the hare, maybe Liz Truss and Kwarteng were the hare who tried to do too much too quickly, and in particular rushed to do big tax cuts before they really develop the supply side program, and that we know what happened there. Whereas in contrast, Hunt and particularly Rishi Sunak, I think might be the tortoise that actually wins the race. I do believe that Rishi Sunak in particular is at heart a free marketeer. He certainly talks a good talk about supporting free market policies. He was originally a Brexiteer and pushed the idea of free ports in particular. Now, I mean, all of us will have some problems with particular parts of that program, but it may well be that having got a degree of political and market stability now, we do have a sounder platform over the next few years for making the sort of supply side reforms that are necessary to close that productivity gap and to get trend growth up again. Big problem though, as ever, is the politics. We know that an awful lot of this stuff is going to be very difficult to get through in what's going to be a very awkward couple of years before the next election. Planning reform being the prime example of that. The number of Conservative MPs objecting to development in their area, whether that's housing or infrastructure or something to tackle the problems on energy supply. So I think what we've seen in terms of the restoration of a bit of political and market stability is a necessary condition for stronger economic growth and for getting those supply reforms through, but clearly not a sufficient one. It does require a lot of political will, and all sorts of areas of it we're seeing pushback against that. I mentioned planning reform. Another is people now moaning about the trade deals we've done with Australia because they allow us more access to cheaper imports of Australian food at some point in the far distant future. Now that's classic protectionism. The whole point is to help consumers, not to protect particular types of producer in the UK, even Welsh farmers. So I think we have made a bit of a step forward in the sense that we now have a bit of political and market stability, but whether the politicians really have the guts to take advantage of that platform, I'm really not sure.
Well, Julian, on that slightly pessimistic or hopeful note, depending on whether or not the anti-growth coalition, as they've now been labelled, can be defeated. Thank you so much for joining the IEA podcast. And if you are enjoying, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider or to the IEA's YouTube channel. And if you'd like to support the IEA, please do visit iea.org.uk and you can become a Patreon for special benefits.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.